So Mark, we've been in this series on dark spaces and sort of dark caves, the metaphorical places that we find ourselves in. And so to talk about that, we've been talking about these literal dark spaces and caves that we've been in. And it's funny, a couple of weeks ago when we kicked off the series, I couldn't think of a time specifically for me, so I just used your story from Wind Cave.
That's amazing. You just borrowed my story.
Yeah, totally.
And,
I mean, I credit it to you, but yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been in a lot of dark spaces, and I've had no trouble coming up with illustrations for this series. But I've talked to other people who've had the same thing. Like they were like, I've never been in a cave. I've never been in a mine. Other people, maybe it doesn't even sound good to go in those places. Have you been able to think of anything, like any dark spaces that you've been in?
Yeah. Well, it was funny. I went home that afternoon and my husband reminded me that the summer that we met on a mission trip to Romania, and it was sort of like a few days before we went to Romania, we went to Paris for team building training, stuff like that. And we went to catacombs in Paris, and so we're under the city, and there's
dark spaces.
It was a dark space.
Yeah.
But as I was thinking about it, I thought of like roller coasters are a place that I remember being in, like a really dark place. You know, you're outside and it's sunny and bright, and then you go into a tunnel and it's pitch black. You can't see anything. Nothing's like you can't tell what's going on. And my favorite one is this roller coaster in Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it's one of those that like starts you and it just shoots you off like a rubber band.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Yeah. And
0 to whatever.
0 to 60, 0 to 100, whatever, I don't know. And this one goes into a tunnel and stops. And I was expecting it to just shoot us out from there. And instead, it dropped us. Ooh. Like a dead drop. I have no idea. 10, 20, 30, I don't know how. I don't know. But like, it's so surprising that all I could do was just laugh and shock the rest of the ride. It was so fun.
It sounds like you enjoyed that. I've been hearing lots of dark spaces stories from people, and one person was like, this series could be done anytime. Like, I'm not a fan of dark spaces, don't like caves, don't like mines, don't like cramped, dark, can't predict where it's going spaces. And they were like, anytime this series is done, like, that'll be fine with me.
Well, good news for them. We're wrapping up the series today, the series that we've been calling Meeting God in Dark Spaces. And it's based on a series from Grace Church in Florida called Everybody Needs Some Cave Time. We started the series on Easter, and we've just been talking about all these kind of hard places that we find ourselves in. And today we're going to continue that series with by looking at a real life family who were friends of Jesus, and they had to confront the cave of grief.
So the story that we're going to look at, it takes place in the Gospel of John. John is the fourth gospel, and these are accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. And in John's gospel, he describes this family that Jesus has a relationship with. So there's two sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus. And John likes to write throughout his gospel about love, and it's very clear that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are very dear to Jesus. He enjoys spending time with them. He goes to their house a lot. And it seems like spending time with them was a place of relaxation and restoration for him. It's a place where he could sort of unwind and spend time with good friends. So one day in John, Jesus is teaching, and he gets this message that from Mary and Martha that their brother Lazarus is sick. And Jesus gets this message, and he doesn't drop what he's doing. He just continues doing what he was doing. He continues teaching and doing his public ministry. And then after a couple days, he begins his journey to Mary and Martha. And when he begins that journey, one of the things that John makes clear is he's going back to a region where he had faced threats before, and so he's going to go back to this region where potentially his life is at risk.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that John also tells us that Jesus already knows what's going to happen. Like, he already knows that Lazarus has died. In John 11:17, it says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. So one thing that's different about their culture than ours, one thing among many things, is that when people were buried, they were buried in caves. And so Mary and Martha are facing this literal cave that is representative of their grief and their personal loss of their brother. But it's not just a personal loss. There's also a very real sense in which their economic and social security in their community would have been threatened. Like they probably depended on their brother for that link into their community. And so this was a really big loss for them.
One of the other things that jumped out at me when you were reading that verse is the fact that he was in that cave for 4 days. For 4 days. That's a really important detail in the story, and part of the reason that's an important detail is something that we might not understand today. Had to do with the Jewish customs and beliefs of that day. And they believed that when someone died, their soul would still be in their body for 3 days, and then after the third day, the soul would depart. And so if you were to go to Israel today and you were to look at some of these ancient caves that served as tombs for people, you'd find like a little tiny opening where the soul was thought that it could escape from the body.
That's amazing. So this means the fact that Lazarus has been in there for 4 days, he's not just dead, he's dead. This reminds me of Miracle Max in Princess Bridie's. There is a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
All dead.
Lazarus is all dead. His soul had departed. There was no hope. There was no life. This grave became Mary and Martha's cave of grief. So all of us are going to encounter grief at some point in our stories and our journeys. Some of us might be currently grieving a loss, like the ones that Mary and Martha were grieving. And I also can't help but think about how, in the last 3 years, 7 million people have died from COVID-19. Just from COVID-19. I mean, it's a lot of people, a lot of lives and extended family who have been impacted by that loss. But death isn't the only kind of grief. It comes in all kinds of different shapes and forms. The loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, a divorce, a miscarriage. Even good changes can carry with them grief. Any big transition in your life is probably going to have some layers of grief to it.
Well, that's a really important reminder today.
It really is important. And I mean, I've experienced this in the last year alone. Even though I love Sycamore Creek Church, I'm falling in love with Lansing. Our transition here meant saying goodbye to a city that I loved living in. It meant saying goodbye to friends and people that I really cared about. There was a church that I was leading, and I loved the people that I still do love the people I was leaving. I had friends that I had to say goodbye to, and there was a lot of grief in that. Another way I've experienced that grief this year is I have an aging relative who's experiencing some mental decline, and the last time I saw her, she didn't know who I was.
That's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. And, my family has just been through so many changes, good and hard, that there's just been grief layered into that. So what about you, Mark? What places have you experienced grief over the last couple of years?
Well, I think, one place, grief literally over death, where we kind of started with this cave of grief related to death, is at the beginning of the pandemic, my grandmother passed away. And at the beginning of the pandemic, everything just shut down, and it was so weird. And so I can still remember we had a service for my grandmother where only a couple family members could be there. We were limited to 12 people or something. And so I was able to go and be a part of the funeral service, but my wife Jana and my kids weren't able to go and be a part of it. And I think over the past several years, and a lot of the experiences we've had of grief have been compounded by all the changes we've had to deal with throughout the pandemic. And I know for me, as a pastor, there's been a lot of grief in the midst of all the transitions. Okay, we can't do this, let's figure out how to do this. Okay, we can't do that, let's figure out how to do this. And there's been a lot of adjusting and kind of on the fly figuring things out. And it's been exhausting, and I think in the midst of all those transitions, there's a grief that happens in the midst of it that makes all of life more difficult. Now again, grief can come in lots of different forms, and it can be good things, good transitions that produce grief, where we're leaving other things behind. It can also be, the loss of a loved one, but just all these transitions, all these changes involve grief. So here's our first question for discussion today. Tell us about a time where you've experienced grief in your life.
So I've been in the cave of grief in different ways and different times, and I think when you're in the cave of grief, you can't really help but wrestle with some loss, some confusion, maybe anger. There could even be a sense of like guilt of like what you could have done or what you didn't do, like that would have helped you avoid it. The cave of grief, it can be all consuming, but we have learned this truth, and it's helpful to remember it, that a cave can either be a hiding place or a holy place.
Yes, it can. And we don't need to add misery on top of our grief by going into hiding when we're in this cave. Grief is painful enough without us being isolated and hidden. And there's an important thing that we learn from Mary and Martha in the cave of grief that they find themselves in. And that's that Jesus can bring healing. Jesus can bring healing. And what makes our cave of grief holy isn't removing our pain or our difficulty or whatever we're facing. The absence of pain isn't what makes the cave holy. It's the presence of Jesus with us in that cave. And so as we continue through the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, we can ask ourselves this question about our own cave of grief, and it's, how can Jesus heal me? How can Jesus heal me in the cave of grief? Now, notice something about that question. It's in the cave of grief. Jesus doesn't expect us to pull ourselves out of the cave of grief and then we'll encounter Jesus in his healing. It's not like when we're in the cave of grief, we need to, just pull ourselves together, or, there's a purpose for this. We need to find the silver lining or whatever it might be. Jesus comes to us in the midst of our grief. He enters into our cave. He enters into our darkness, and he brings the light of his life into that cave.
Yeah, that's really good news.
It is good news.
Let's talk for a little bit about what that looks like when Jesus goes into the cave. What is he doing? What is happening? How can we welcome him? So the first thing that we can talk about is that Jesus welcomes my confusion. There is nothing more confusing than grief and loss. It's disorienting. It can feel like the ground is shifting underneath you. What you thought was true, what you thought you had control over, has all of a sudden changed and shifted, and you have to kind of reorient your whole way of looking at the world in that moment. And we see this in the ways that Mary and Martha both respond when Jesus shows up. It says, when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. So Martha rushes out to meet Jesus, and Mary stays back for a bit. And I think it's really interesting how the sisters give each other room to interact with Jesus on their own timetable and approach him at their own time. Grief, I think, demands really that we give space for different people to move at different paces and on their own schedule.
Yeah, they do give each other space, and eventually they both come to Jesus. And it's interesting because at different times, they both come to Jesus and they say the same thing. Yeah. They both say, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, if we think about this, we think about their past week. They would have been sitting there with their brother Lazarus. They're probably, holding his hand, wiping his brow, and they're holding out hope. Lord, if only you would get here, we know that our brother will be healed. And you can imagine them sitting there and getting up to check at the window. And you can imagine them looking out at the path leading to their house. Lord, if only you would get here, we know that he'll be okay. And you can imagine them praying, Jesus, hurry up. Jesus, get
Where
here.
are you?
Get here,
Yeah.
where are you? And then eventually Lazarus stops breathing. And you can imagine them thinking like, where's Jesus? Like, he's not here. And then you can imagine, they put him in the tomb. They put him in this grave. And they're like, well, if Jesus can make it within the 3-day window, right?
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
we'll be okay. And day 1 passes, and Jesus doesn't come. And day 2 passes, and Jesus doesn't come. And day 3 passes, and still Jesus hasn't come. And that's a long process to go through. And you can just imagine the anguish and the darkness that consumed them at that time, the hopelessness that they must have felt. And I imagine they were probably questioning, this is what we do when we're grieving. They were confused. They were wondering, like, I thought we had this special relationship with Jesus. I thought he really cared about me. Like, where is he when we needed him? Lord, if only you had been here.
Yeah, that confusion, the confusion of grief, it causes us, I think, to search for those answers. And even to interrogate God, like, where were you? What I love about this passage is that Jesus seems to be welcoming of their questions. Like, he's not shaming them. He's not saying, like, don't you believe? You should look on the bright side. Aren't I here? Like, what are you talking about? Like, none of that comes across. He just welcomes it. Jesus knows that the cave of grief is not a puzzle to be solved, but a relationship to be lived. And so it's in the security of their relationship, of Jesus' presence, that they can ask those questions. They can bring voice to them. And I mean, I've found this to be true in my own life. I've discovered that Jesus is big enough and secure enough to handle my confusion. Like, I don't have to hold back or be really careful how I word things or anything like that. I'm sure you know this, but there's a whole book in the Old Testament that's called Lamentations.
That's such a good reminder. Yeah.
And Lamentations, it literally means a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. Jesus is big enough to handle my passionate expression of grief and sorrow. Some of us, I think, need to get kind of messy in our prayers, in the ways, in a similar way, I think, to the way that Mary and Martha do. Lord, if only you had been here. Grief is not the time for sanitized prayers. Grief demands that we get really real with Jesus. And in a way, I think honesty is the beginning of healing. Honesty is the beginning of our healing. And Jesus welcomes that confusion. So this actually brings us to our second question for discussion. Do you feel like you can be honest with God about what you're feeling? Why or why not?
So we're going to find healing in this cave of grief. We're going to make it a holy place, not a hiding place. First of all, we need to realize that Jesus welcomes my confusion. But secondly, we need to realize that Jesus joins me in my crying. Now, this is an important thing. We have to think of this scene with Mary and Martha that Jesus is entering into as it was probably quite a bit chaotic. At that time, there were professional mourners. And so these were people who were hired to cry on behalf of the family. This is really hard for me to imagine as a reserved
right.
West Michigan guy. But what an interesting career, right? To make your livelihood weeping and crying and wailing. And John tells us that since Bethany is only 2 miles from Jerusalem, that many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So Mary comes out of the house and she falls at Jesus' feet, and she's most likely, just weeping and crying as she does. And John says that Jesus looks around and he sees the scene, he sees all the emotion of it, and then Jesus wept. Whenever a heart is broken, whenever a grave is opened, Jesus weeps with us. The Jesus who laughs and who celebrates and is with us in the good times of life also laments and cries with us in those hard times that we experience. And unlike a professional mourner who's, they're probably faking it, right? Jesus really cares about this family. And so being fully human, Jesus feels the depth of grief the same way that we feel the depth of grief. And this reminds us that we need others to weep when we weep.
Yeah. I know that you've heard this story a few times, and probably other people have heard this story, but
It's still worth repeating.
yeah, well, and there's an element to it that I think relates to this. I 10 years ago, I had a miscarriage. A few months later, we tried again. And in that time, it was a few weeks of like getting blood work done and tracking numbers of hormones and all kinds of stuff. And it was every time I would go in, it would be like, well, it's moving in the right direction, but not really at the pace we would hope, and so I had to keep going back and keep going back. And so in that waiting time, we invited some close friends to just be praying for us. Eventually we realized that I had miscarried a second time. And I remember one of the most meaningful expressions of community that we experienced was a friend of ours who didn't live in the area called and left a voicemail. And she just said, I am so sorry. I don't know why this happened. And we could hear that she was crying in her voice. And that meant so much. Like, just, I'm sorry. I don't understand either. And like, she's crying with us. It really, really went a long way to have people who were with us in that kind of a way. And Jesus does that too. He weeps with his friends. And I think he weeps with us too. And I wonder, like, why is it that like Jesus would do that? I mean, I think it's because death is not God's plan for us. Death is not part of God's good plan for us. And so when a loved one dies, when wars don't cease, when children are abused, when disasters happen, when injustice and oppression continue to murder people, our hearts cry out, it's not supposed to be this way. And I think Jesus agrees with us and weeps with us too.
He does. And in the midst of our cave of grief, Jesus comes to us, meets us there, and we can find healing through Jesus when, first of all, we recognize that Jesus welcomes my confusion, also that Jesus joins me in my crying, but then finally that Jesus offers me his confidence. You see, Jesus doesn't always just listen and weep with us. Jesus also takes action. And so Jesus is a wonderful counselor. He is also Almighty God, and death is no match for Jesus. And so what Jesus does, he gets there and he weeps, and then he goes to that grave. And remember, that grave has been sealed for 4 days. And Jesus says, "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." What seems utterly impossible through human means, right, is made possible through Jesus. Jesus grieves, Jesus weeps, but then Jesus knows that he's God, and God has the power over death itself. So with a word, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. His heart begins to beat with atrial and ventricular contractions. His blood begins to flow through Lazarus's arteries and veins. The bronchioles of his lungs begin to fill with air, and that flowing blood begins to pick up oxygen that oxygenates his blood, and it goes to his muscles, and his brain neurons begin to fire. His muscles begin to prepare to relax and contract. Lazarus is alive. It's incredible.
So incredible. I can't help but wonder, like, how this affected him for the rest of his life. Like,
yes.
Was he so much more confident, like unafraid of death because he had already
He didn't have a
experienced it?
near-death experience. He had an all-death experience,
He was all
like
dead.
we said.
Like, or maybe did Jesus' confidence become his confidence? His name means God helps. So maybe that was a reminder to him of this miracle for the rest of his life. But the thing about this miracle is that it points not only to this moment where Lazarus gets a new lease on old life in his body, but this event also points to Jesus' command over death itself, then and forever. Lazarus, He would eventually die again, right? But Jesus is pointing his followers to this reality that the finished work of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection, like he's pointing to this reality that's to come of Jesus conquering death. And we just celebrated that at Easter. When Lazarus does eventually die for good, his sisters could trust that they would be with his brother in eternity because of what Jesus had done on the cross. The good news here is that death is not the end of the story. Whatever loss we're grieving right now is not the end of the story. We learned at Easter, the worst thing is never the last thing. There might be endings like within the story, like chapters that are ending, but the story itself isn't over. And Jesus offers that confidence to us today. And then there's one more thing that Jesus does. We've talked about how Jesus welcomes my confusion, joins me in crying, offers me his confidence. Jesus also extends to me his community.
He does. And as this miracle of new life takes place, Lazarus is alive again. Jesus has instructions for all who have gathered there at that cave of grief. Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Now, the story continues. Lazarus is alive, and he emerges from this cave. And Jesus has instructions for Mary and for Martha and for all those who have gathered around. And it's unwrap him and let him go. And so following those instructions, Mary and Martha and everyone else there, they had to break Jewish law because he's alive, but he has been a corpse, right? And they're going to go and they're going to touch this corpse of their beloved brother, their friend. And together in community, they approach Lazarus and they unwrap the grave clothes from around him. Now, I imagine that each of those people who helped remove those grave clothes, and we have to remember, again, he'd been in there for 4 days. So, fluids had leaked out and, the smell had to be really bad. And they're transformed, though, by this experience. There's this stink of death on the grave clothes, and yet here's Lazarus alive. And maybe they experienced in that moment the awe of Jesus' power, the hope that we have that death doesn't have the final word. And this is really powerful. Allowing others to care for us and to be with us is a really powerful thing in the cave of grief. So let's pause one final time and ask a question about our experiences of community. How have you experienced community in the cave of grief? Let's take a moment and talk about that.
So the cave of grief, it can bind us all in a sort of grave clothes. For a time and a season, I think this is a really good and important part of being in the cave of grief, of moving through grief. But I believe that there comes a time when Jesus will say, unbind him, unbind her, let's go. There's a time for everything, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. There's a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve, a time to dance. And this journey that we go on from crying to laughing and grieving to dancing, it usually involves other people coming around us to help us. Now, there's no set timeline on this, so we shouldn't be rushing people through it. And don't rush yourself through it either. Stay present to yourself, what Jesus is speaking to you, what you're learning along the way. Jesus can heal us in our cave of grief, and he does so by welcoming our confusion, by weeping with us, giving us his confidence, extending his community to us.
Yeah, so for each of us, I think there's an invitation. And if we're currently in the cave of grief, it's to receive Jesus' welcoming solidarity. Jesus welcomes our confusion, and Jesus weeps with us. Jesus offers his confidence to us in the midst of this cave and extends his community. And maybe you're not in the cave of grief right now. And for people who don't have that, that's great. But you probably know someone who is. And remember, you don't always get to the cave of grief through death. There are lots of reasons, lots of ways that we can get into this cave. And so if you're only on the outside looking in, I want to encourage us today, like, let's take our cues from Jesus. Let's welcome our friends' confusion. Let's not try to solve problems for them or provide all the solutions or answers. Let's not try to tie things up with a neat, pretty bow.
Right.
But let's be willing to let where we are be confusing for our friends and our family members. And in the midst of that, when we join someone in their cave of grief, let yourself be moved by the other person's grief. Weep with them when it feels right to do so.
Yeah, this is so powerful. You're talking about the ways that we can take our cues from Jesus when we're caring for our friends who are grieving. And the next one in that line, you talked about like welcoming confusion, weeping with people. The next one is offering people our confidence. And this one is tricky.
That is tricky.
Because we don't want to bypass people's grief. Like, this confidence is not confidence in our ability to erase the confusion, right? We're supposed to be welcoming the confusion. We can be confident that God is good even when things are hard.
That's such an important point.
We can be confident that the worst thing is never the last thing, even when the worst thing is really, really hard. And we can also extend our community. So, if it makes sense to mobilize people to care for your grieving friend, do it. Put together a meal train. You might sit vigil with them. Call your person who lives near them. Like, take them out to coffee. There's all kinds of ways that we can come around them. Sometimes extending our community can just mean that you show up for them, that you make space for them, that you sit with them.
And if today you're sitting listening to this message and you are not in the cave of grief, that's really amazing. And if you are thinking, I don't know anyone who's in the cave of grief, that's pretty amazing too. But I hope that you've taken note of what you and I have been talking about, because you are going to encounter the cave of grief at some point, like we all will. And I hope that we prepare ourselves for that experience and for those dark spaces and those dark times that we are inevitably going to encounter ourselves or through someone that we care about. And so as today we've talked about this cave of grief and about the community that supports us in the midst of our grief, I want to close by just another reminder that this is really tough stuff. And it's tough to be in grief. It's tough to be in community with other people who are grieving. And so what we do as a community is we return again and again to Jesus. We'll do our best in the midst of this tough place in life. And hopefully we'll encounter God's grace in the midst of that. And our prayer is that we as a community would be a community who follow Jesus' example into the cave of grief and hopefully out of the cave of grief.
Yeah, I love that. So to close, I just want to share a prayer from Cole Arthur Riley. She is the creator of Black Liturgies. She's on Instagram. She's probably on other social media platforms. And she also wrote a book called This Here Flesh, which I highly recommend. I'm gonna read this prayer from her to close. God who knows sorrow, thank you for being a God who is moved to tears. For in doing, you remind us that we can believe healing is coming and still make space to grieve what it is. Remind us that hope and lament are not mutually exclusive. We confess that we are at times threatened by sadness in one another. We rush to resolve it. Grant us companions capable of remaining with us in our sadness. Not so they can speak platitudes over us or try to drag our souls toward happiness, but so they can hold space for our pain, reminding us that our stories are not a burden. Help us to hold our tears as sacred, never being too quick to wipe them away or hold them prisoner, knowing that our freedom is entwined with theirs. Our spirit aches, but not alone. Lament is sacred, and I am free to feel. Amen.